I wanted to get a little bit of a temperature of the room. Is anyone who's not related to me from Chicago or ever lived in Chicago? You put your hand down. Okay, so a good number. And have other people from the U.S.? Okay. So I'll talk a little bit, do some scene setting about Chicago, why I wrote the book, what I was trying to do with this project, and how I think it even relates globally. So my husband and I got here on Sunday, and I don't speak French, but we picked up Le Monde, and there was this huge feature inside about segregation on Chicago's South Side, and a Q&A with Jesse Jackson in French. And there was a map of Chicago. It had my neighborhood, Hyde Park. I live near the University of Chicago. It had Roseland, a neighborhood that my friend who lives here is from. And it had a number of black neighborhoods. And it's like, wow, okay, so there's some talk. And I know that Chicago, for the past, I would say 10 years, has somewhat been the center of the universe because of Barack Obama. And also, if you live in the United States and any sort of violence happens, all eyes turn to Chicago. And our current president, I mean, I'm sure you know about all the issues that we're facing with gun violence. And Chicago becomes this proxy for a lot of issues. And when gun reform is talked about, what is said is, well, Chicago has gun reform and people still kill. Or President Trump will go on Twitter and say that Chicago's a hellhole. Black and brown people are living in terrible places, and he's going to bring the National Guard or some sort of federal agency. So on one hand, I think that he just hates Barack Obama so much that Chicago becomes a focal point for him, as well as for the right in the country, it becomes, oh, well, Chicago is violent, gun laws don't work, it's the wild, wild west out there. I would say, since I've been a reporter at WBEZ, I came there in 2007, right before Obama really catapulted to the national scene. And I can tell you, everybody from, I mean, we've had French radio stations come to Chicago, we've had the BBC, I've been interviewed in German. All sorts of international publications have come to either talk about Obama or to talk about violence. And violence is talked about in a vacuum. It's talked about as if Black and Latino people are completely out of control and all we do in our neighborhoods is shoot each other. And I've even had people who I think are smart, other journalists in the United States, who've come to do stories and they've said, you know, am I going to be safe? Again, reasonable people, but the image is that there is gunslinging on every single corner of Chicago. I'm talking about violence and segregation to make this link. The most segregated neighborhoods, racially and economically, in Chicago are the most segregated. So it's really not rocket science if you want to solve something like gun violence. Now, of course, violence can spread. I mean, we have access to guns in the United States, unlike other places. So it's not that only you are in a low-income neighborhood that you're at risk for gun violence. We know that that's not true. However, if you look at the per capita in the neighborhoods where there's been deindustrialization, where you have seen jobs go away, where you see schools not doing well, when you see, I mean, a big thing is, are there grocery stores in your neighborhoods? Very basic living things. And working at WBZ, I felt like the big elephant in the room was segregation. Chicago is unique compared to places like Baltimore, Philadelphia, Cleveland. Chicago is segregated like a lot of cities in the Midwest and the Northeast, but we are diverse. Chicago is about a third Black, a third Latino, and a third white. Now, the power structure ends up being white politically, and it seems like Black and brown communities are scrapping for who's going to be second place. However, there are opportunities for integration or desegregation. And my argument in the book is that until we address segregation, we're going to continue to be a city of inequities. Integration or segregation is not about as a black parent, I need my child to sit next to a white student to do better. Segregation is about resources and proximity to power. And we know in the United States that there is no separate but equal. Separate equals, separate is unequal. And when you have a system that perpetuates that, you're going to continue to have those inequities, which I argue are racialized. Race and class are first cousins, but we've also had this conversation in the United States where we want to move toward a class-based argument. Because quite frankly, I think that talking about class makes white people feel better in the United States. You think that it's an equalizer. Oh, well, if I just, lifting all tides, everyone will do well. No, you can be an upper earning African American in the black community. Your home value is going to be less. You are going to have fewer amenities. You cannot, again, grocery store becomes this basic amenity that we use to tell the temperature of a neighborhood. You are still dealing with inequity. So if you are poor and black, yes, those inequities are going to look different, but the inequities span no matter what your income is if you are an African American living in segregation. And I was finding that covering stories like as a daily or enterprise features investigative reporter covering neighborhoods, that this was the issue that no one wanted to talk about. You have politicians say, well, segregation, that's not my problem to fix. That's just how Chicago is. So segregation is talked about in the same breath that Chicago has stunning architecture. Lake Michigan is beautiful. Yeah, we're segregated, as if it was something that just happened. And it was deliberate. There were sets of policies that happened after the Great Migration. So I'm the granddaughter of the Great Migration. All four of my grandparents moved to Chicago. And those policies didn't only say, let's keep black people in certain neighborhoods. It also said, black people in these black neighborhoods, we're also not going to give them loans. We're going to redline them. We're going to draw a line and say they don't have loans. So I see that as like double discrimination. We don't want you to live with us, and we also don't want you to get loans or to build wealth. The book came out 2 years ago, and even before then, I had been saying for quite some time that somewhere along in our U.S. history, it was decided that wealth building was via home ownership. And I didn't really know why. And there was a book that came out, if this topic is of interest to you. There's a book that came out last year by Richard Rothstein called The Color of Law, where he really just lays out all the different housing segregationist policies from California to the East Coast. And it actually happened because of Woodrow Wilson. He thought that if Americans owned land, they would be less likely to revolt the way people in the Soviet Union were revolting. Get them invested, get them to be landowners. Well, it was still very hard to be a homeowner regardless of race or income back then. And so under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, you had programs come in to build home ownership that, kept black people out. The GI Bill didn't go to black people the same way. The Federal Housing Administration, even after redlining wasn't technically happening anymore, or racially restrictive covenants were struck down by the Supreme Court, you had suburbs that were built, white suburbs that were built in places like the Chicago area and around the country that kept black people out. So the premise of my book, I laid out what my thesis was, but how did I want to tell this story? Chicago has been under a microscope for 100 years, and a lot of that work goes back to the University of Chicago sociologists. And I just mentioned Richard Rothstein's work. My book cites all of these scholars that came before me. There is really nothing new to say about the policies, but I wanted to show how these policies are still affecting neighborhoods and how current policies that weren't struck down by the Supreme Court, for example, are still perpetuating segregation. I also wanted to be careful not to paint black neighborhoods or black Chicagoans as pathological, that again needed some kind of fixing. So the first chapter is about growing up in a Southside neighborhood, middle class, called Chatham. I love Chatham. I can tell you that I've never lived anywhere else in my life where I knew every single person on the block. It was that kind of block club ethos, efficacy in the neighborhood. My siblings and I would put flyers for block clubs, the community meetings. My dad had us canvassing, doing the work for him, helping him do this kind of work. And we knew that there was a lot of work that was put in to maintain the neighborhood. We went to church in the neighborhood. We had Girl Scouts. We had day camp. We had friends. We weren't limited to our neighborhood. We did go elsewhere, but it was a great Black middle class cozy cocoon. But there is something called the Black tax. Goods and services being higher, your housing value being less, as I mentioned. My parents knew they wanted to live in that neighborhood, and they bought in 1974 their Cape Cod home for $30,000. When I was in college in 1996, they sold that home and moved to an integrated neighborhood, the Beverly Morgan Park area, which is also the same neighborhood where we were bused to school. I'll talk about busing a little bit later. And I was devastated. My sister was still in high school. My brother and sister were still in high school when they moved, but I felt like they were taking a piece of my childhood. I'm sure you've heard about the economic crash. A generation of Black wealth was wiped out through home ownership. If my parents had stayed in Chatham, there's a good chance that their home value would have been about $30,000 at the lowest point. Now, they did not have a fortune teller globe to tell them this. They always saw that home as a starter home. They wanted a bigger home. And when I've talked to them subsequently for the book, they intuitively knew that values would be better in an integrated neighborhood, even though it's more white than Black. And they have this nest egg. So, I was a pretty silly teenager, 19-year-old and 20-year-old in 1996, crying and weeping about how could you leave our neighborhood, how could you leave our home. But my parents are retired, and I know that they have this nest egg, and that's not something that a lot of Black families can say post-recession. And that's not to say that people should not buy in a Black neighborhood, but you have to look at your investments and how you want to have that retirement, because again, this is the biggest purchase that people are using, and this is how they are building and transferring wealth. The second chapter is called Jim Crow in Chicago, where I chronicle all the different policies that happened. I was really surprised at how many Chicagoans did not know this, so I'm going to tell this story because I'm going to assume that you all may not know this too. But Lorraine Hansberry's play, A Raisin in the Sun, was based off of the experience of her family in Chicago. Her parents moved to a white neighborhood, and the white people were not happy. Her mother had to patrol the house at night with a gun. She came from a pretty middle-class family. They had, scholars who would visit. Her father was a lawyer. He liked to sue the government. He sued over many things. And the homeowners association, that was white, said, you can't be here. And the courts told them they had to move. Well, Carl Hansberry didn't take that lightly. And there's a case, Hansberry versus Lee, where the court ruled that they could come to the neighborhood, or they didn't have to leave they shouldn't have had to leave the neighborhood. Well, it wasn't because of equal protection under the law. It was because not enough homeowners signed the petition to keep Black people out the neighborhood. And after that, 500 homes opened up in the neighborhood. And Hansberry versus Lee is considered the precursor to Shelley versus Kramer. Shelley versus Kramer was the 1948 law that struck down racially restrictive covenants. And I might have gone by that too quickly. Racially restrictive covenants were deeds to the house that said you cannot rent or sell your home to a Black person. And so Black people in the Great Migration were relegated to the Black Belt, but there was overcrowding. You had slum housing, you had fire-gutted apartment buildings, and it was, a vibrant place. Blues was there. A lot of artists were there. There was a Black Chicago Renaissance that happened in the Black Belt. But you also had all these housing troubles that were there as well. And when the 1948 ruling came down, Black people moved to other neighborhoods on the south side. And so then what happened is white flight. And we often talk about white flight in Chicago in a vacuum, as if white people packed their bags in these neighborhoods and went to go live in the open prairie. no, the white people had somewhere to go with white flight. And that's what I was mentioning about the suburbs that were created for them. You had expressways that were built. The federal government paved the red carpet for white flight to happen. I have a chapter on why integration didn't work in Chicago public schools. And the short answer would be our former mayor, Richard J. Daley, who had more power than all the congressmen combined from Illinois, and would get these edicts from Washington, D.C., and would say, we're not doing that. And I'm going to get the delegation to withhold votes on certain things if you try to push this integration thing. So, there was a moment in Chicago's history where integration could have happened in the school system. And the research is very steady in showing that integration affects all students, not just black students, but it helps white students or students of all races as well. And so then it came my turn to buy a condo, and I moved into what was known as the former Black Belt, but was Bronzeville. Bronzeville was the Harlem of the south side of Chicago. And I bought a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom condo with gated parking, brand new kitchen, brand new everything for $172,000. And by the time I tried to unload the property when I was ready to get married, the property was appraised at $45,000. You can get a car for a car for $45,000. And so I write about you had a lot of black professionals who moved to Bronzeville. And there's this theory that, green rules everything, but you had people with higher income move in. You still had low income people in the neighborhood. You still had depopulation, but you did not see the capital follow. Chicago public housing was at one point had some of the largest public housing structures in the world, and one of them was the Robert Taylor homes. And the Chicago Housing Authority built a lot of its public housing in segregated black neighborhoods because the white politicians didn't want it in their neighborhoods. And Chicago is very balkanized. We have 50 city council members, and I believe New York has 51. And New York is about 4 times the population of Chicago. So you don't find a lot of regional cooperation, suburb versus city, county versus county, and you don't find it in the city as well. So if you carve out these small little areas, I call them fiefdoms, then you can have a white alderman say, well, I don't want that here. If your area were larger and you had different boundaries, it wouldn't be so easy to, that goes for zoning, for any other kinds of housing, because affordable housing is still a fight in Chicago right now. And a lot of people try to keep it out. We don't want those people in our neighborhoods. And so I argue that the vertical segregation, the high rises, have now turned into horizontal segregation because you have given people housing vouchers to live in the private market, and the money doesn't go far enough. And so you have found that people are living in, once again, racially and economically segregated neighborhoods. They just may be in the private market renting versus living in government housing. I have a chapter about the death of black politics, how the death of Harold Washington really fractured the black community in terms of having a unified political agenda. And of course, there's a chapter on violence where I did a media study of the Chicago Tribune, the Chicago Sun-Times over 40 years, and looked at how they covered violence. And this was typically, the violence was in looking at black South Side and West Side neighborhoods. But what I also found is that Chicago has historically been a violent city. Last night, my husband and I were in a cab. Where are you from? Chicago. Oh, Michael Jordan. I didn't think people were still saying that. I tend to hear more Barack Obama. But at one point when you traveled, you would hear bang, bang, Al Capone if you were a Chicagoan and you traveled outside of the country. There are tours in Chicago right now gangster tours that will take you around to all the mob places. So I took one of those tours to show how white violence is treated as like this really like cute mob thing that was happening in no relation to prohibition, the violence. Chicago has always been more violent than any other city. This is not new. Like, really nothing is new. I found in the 1920s, the Chicago Tribune had a hand clock on its front page counting the murders. What was the difference? It was white on white violence. You know, I say that in quotes because I don't believe in black on black violence. You kill people who are in proximity to you. If you're in a segregated neighborhood, these are the people you know, that's who you're going to kill. And we definitely do not say white on white violence in the United States. So a lot of the violence that was happening after the turn of the century were young white male immigrants in bars. If you went to a bar after work, there's a good chance someone was going to get murdered in that bar. What happened is that society looked at violence as a societal problem. You had settlement houses, people like Jane Addams that said, this is a community problem. We're going to fix this or look at this holistically. When you see violence in black, and this is starting to shift a little bit, maybe in part because of the international attention that's gotten, but it's been seen as, oh, well, those are just black and brown people killing each other in their neighborhoods. And I really have pushed back against the term gang-related because the police will say that was a gang-related murder. They don't know if the person, I mean, we see if the person has a gang tattoo, they assume that it was a gang murder. And I think using that type of terminology allows people who are white and live on the north side to say, oh, well, that doesn't affect me. They were in a gang. They were deserving. And actually, street workers have found that it's more interpersonal violence. You're more likely to be killed by someone who's in your same clique or gang rather than a rival gang, the way violence was with gangs in the 1980s leading into the early 1990s. But the framework around it has been all wrong, and it's not seen as a problem of the whole city. It's been seen as, well, if black people were just better parents, then there would be nothing wrong. And again, just to circle it back, sometimes it's really hard to like keep up with the different mass murders that happen in the U.S. But the one that's happened since Parkland, the young white male in Austin, Texas, he had been sending bombs out. The coverage says he was a troubled young man who really had a lot of potential. So the language continues to be racialized. He's not a terrorist. And I'm not even arguing that the word terrorist should be even used. Like, I don't think that it's it's kind of like gang related in some instances. And so by, saying this was, a really troubled young man, that type of language would never be used for someone black. And then my last chapter is about trying to be prescriptive. Journalists tend to be, here's the problem. It's not my job to fix it. I'm not a policymaker, and that's fine. We tell people what to think about. We raise issues. We, try to raise hell and to bring an equity to light. But I also interviewed a number of scholars and artists and other writers about what can Chicago do. And one of the things, like when I speak to a lot of white audiences in Chicago, and I don't mind people ask me what it is that they think they can do. But I sometimes think that people are looking for a very short answer from me on how they can dismantle racism or white supremacy. And it's not that simple. So one thing that I have begun telling people is to examine the segregation in their own lives. And that does not mean if you don't have black friends that you go out and rent a black friend. But I want people to think about their own housing choices, think about how the bank might have favored them over other people with similar incomes, why they chose to live in an all-white suburb. And then once they've done even their own self-assessment, thinking about, well, what I say if you like theater, you don't have to go to the major theater houses only in Chicago. There are a lot of places in community that you can do. I think that food, art, and culture are ways that are good entry points into neighborhoods and into the city. Chicago is so massive. Chicago's population is a little bit bigger than Paris, but the density is nowhere near. Chicago's strength and weakness is its vastness. I don't know what to compare it to size-wise, but it is a huge place that has a lot of home ownership. It doesn't have, not all neighborhoods have a ton of high-rises or apartment buildings, but it's very easy for a person to stay within their own bubble, whether that's a suburb or a neighborhood. And so I challenge people to get out of their bubbles and experience things in different ways. There's a scholar in Chicago who talks about this directly that says, we can't look at the food, arts, and culture as extras in a city. These are the things that make up a city. And we have to not think about only funding the Art Institute, the Museum of Contemporary Art, institutions that are always going to have supporters. How do we support the smaller venues? Chicago also, one of its biggest cultural exports is house music, which is much bigger in Europe than it even is to a lot of Chicagoans. A lot of people don't even know what house music is, and that's fine. They don't have to go to the club. They don't have to buy house tracks. But even understanding that this is something, an export that means something to the city and something that can be monetized. And then I go farther and say, there is likely a school or a housing issue, if not in your neighborhood, then in an adjacent neighborhood. And how can you be an ally to other communities? How can you put pressure on issues? How can you, there are all sorts of stereotypes about what affordable housing is. People who have affordable housing do work. Again, there's this image, they're lazy, they're going to bring crime. There are a lot of gated communities in Chicago. Gated meaning that you can only be rich to live there. Places that are downtown are closest to downtown. And that's not an equitable way. It's not a sustainable way to keep a city. And even just this is my 4th time in Paris, but even all these past few days, I think about how do you integrate businesses? How do you, there's certain things that are all the same in cities. And that's what I was considering. Well, you have to have housing. You have to have transportation. I wrote a column for the Sun-Times recently about what a utopia Chicago looked like. I hope no one laughs at me and says, it's actually very horrible. But I said I wish we had a transit system like Paris. I wish that the trains could go everywhere, we have lines that run 24 hours. Maybe they're north and south, but it would be great to have a system that allowed people to get anywhere that they needed to be. And so, dreaming big about what are the things that we want to see in our city. You have the institutions. We have policing that is an issue. We have the jail system that's an issue. But what about the arts? What about how we use libraries, how we use park spaces? And I think these are things that cities all over the world are grappling with, and a lot of them do better than Chicago. I think that Chicago does some great things as well. I do think our library system is rated #1 in the country, and they have figured out a way to stay relevant even in our digital age. So there are things that other cities look to for us. But I ultimately think that some of these things are very nuts and bolts. No one is going to be going to zoning meetings, but zoning is an area in which discrimination can really thrive. How can you have partnerships? How can you be a more inclusive city? And I think that I find it incredibly cliche to say, we have to have a conversation first. And that always comes up about race. Well, let's just talk to each other. No, people are angry. You're sort of tired of talking about this. You want action. But I will say that there is not an acceptance of segregation. I take that back. There is an acceptance of segregation. There's not an acknowledgement that this is the root of a lot of our problems. And I don't think that segregation or, dismantling it is going to make racism go away. but I also think that you would be creating outcomes for different people in different neighborhoods. And it might have to be talked about in terms of economics. The Metropolitan Planning Council in Chicago put out a report last year called The Cost of Segregation. And it outlined how many fewer people are getting degrees, how much more violence there is, how much money the region is losing, because we are so much more segregated than other cities. If we just had average segregation, all of those outcomes would rise in the city. And so actually, when I get back from Paris, their part 2 will be out, and that's when they're going to start outlining what some of the solutions are. So that's a very brief overview of what I was trying to do with the book. What I wanted was to use my personal story, my family's story, to bring alive some of these policies. Like I said, Chicago's been written about for a long time. But one of the biggest compliments I've gotten particularly from Black people, have been, wow, like this was my story, but I didn't know it had a name to it. Segregation, housing policies, like residential segregation issues, those are not issues that are really taught in school. And even as a reporter, these are some things, like I knew my neighborhood used to be white and that Black people came in, but I didn't really understand that it wasn't just, oh, I don't want to be here and now I'm leaving. I mean, of course, emotion was part of it, but there were mechanisms in place to make that easier. And so those things aren't taught, and I would love for this just to be the opening of understanding the dynamics of our city, and also having a full breadth of knowledge about how all of this was done on purpose. It is not simply about, oh, well, people want to live around people who are like them. So with that, I think we have about 20 minutes for questions. Thank you. So for some people, and they're joking, but they're kind of serious, is that the true mark of racial progress is that Black people can be mediocre. And there's still this pressure that Black people have to do things so much better because they're going to be judged, or the next Black person who comes after you won't get a chance if that Black person, messes up. And when it comes to representation, there should just really be a variety of expressions of what Blackness is, not just I'm here to uplift the race and I'm doing the race work, and that is fine, but also like Insecure. This is a show on HBO. Dating. I mean, there are some things that may be racially specific with the cultural cues, but dating is a universal issue, no matter your, sexual orientation, where you live. Like there's some things that are just going to be relatable. So having a show like that, is important. I will say that I have found that the dominant narrative, like for Blackness, has been like criminalized. Like, okay, the Black person doing the perp walk on the news, or low income, poor, poverty. And then like the so-called Black exceptionalism, the Oprahs, the athletes, the movie stars, the Obamas. There's a whole lot of Black people in between. Working class, lower middle class, upper middle class. I would say that the invisibility of the Black working and middle class is an issue because of those two extremes. And I think the more stories that you can tell that show, I don't want to say just regular Black people, but not those two narratives are the ones that we see the most. I did spend time in a school in the education chapter, and this was a Black principal at a Black school in Bronzeville, mostly low income, 99.9% Black. And she said that not every teacher is fit for every type of school. There's some teachers that do better at higher performing schools. There's some teachers that do better at a school like hers. The bottom line, though, is what kind of teacher support. There's also research that shows we see a lot of mobility and a lot of transferring of kids in low-income schools because they move a lot. We also see that there's a lot of research that says that school performance can be measured on the longevity of teachers in a school. So nobody wants to be in poor neighborhoods, not the poor families and not the teachers. And so if there's a way to support those teachers, so if you have teachers who have a cohort, who have been in a place longer, they're more likely to come up with solutions on their own, or they feel invested. And partly how they get that is by a principal who supports them, who gives them the resources that they need. And I come from a family of educators, and my aunt is a retired principal. But I call her she's like triage. So like if a principal dies, she's retired, but the school system will call her up to take over in a school if something happened to the principal, like maybe a death of a loved one or surgery, whatever it is. And so one of the things that she has found is how teachers aren't supported. So one day she told the cafeteria staff, look, we're going to do a big teacher appreciation luncheon. We're not going to have the food we feed the kids. How about you all do a fried chicken lunch? And just had this great event. The teachers were like, wow, no one ever thanks us. No one supports us. That's a very small thing, but it's a little thing that a principal can do. And of course, there are bigger things about research and training and professional development days. And, if they're asking for something, giving it to them, if they can. But that's partly why, teachers leave, because they don't feel like maybe they're making a difference in those environments. And it's harder to teach. I have a colleague who's done a series about, we have this false message about life is fair to kids and that education is the great equalizer. And if you just work hard, things are going to work out for you. And that doesn't always happen. And so one of my colleagues spent a year in a school with poverty on the west side of Chicago. And the school was doing everything that it could. But guess what? Those kids still go home to a poverty neighborhood. They still go home to parents who are unemployed. The schools can't save the neighborhood. That doesn't mean the school shouldn't do those things, but you're talking about, and there's also other research out there about Black downward mobility, Black people who even, come from families that are middle class are more likely to slide. So if you're middle class and you're sliding, what if you're poor? There's other research that shows to get out of poverty, you can never make any mistakes. I think it was for 20 years. Everything has to go exceedingly well for you, and you can't have any hiccups. So even though I talked about race, I'm not ignoring class, in this larger discussion, but these outcomes hurt Black neighborhoods more than they hurt other communities. I'm going to ask my sister if anybody's working on this. She works in banking finance.
Yes. Yeah, no, the answer is yes. We're looking at the Community Reinvestment Act. You're absolutely right. And unfortunately, I think there's some that are going to exempt some institutions from those requirements, which probably aren't the best thing. But it's an old law. It's an old act. And people have been trying to revisit it for a while. And I think hopefully they will, because it does need to be modernized.
I'm going to ask my sister to answer that too. Well, South Shore Bank doesn't exist anymore. It's Urban Partnership Bank. And they've actually been, they closed in South Shore.
I know.
Yeah. Okay.
I grew up in Marinoka, and then we moved
Okay.
to Martin, so can you say anything about what's your analysis of that?
That it's hard being in Black community. Lending, I think the larger issue that speaks to both of your questions is what is the capital that comes into Black neighborhoods? And I'm working on a project now looking at some investment, and Black developers and maybe I'll ask my husband to stand up also. He's a developer. um, Black developers and Black communities don't have the same access to capital. They're not getting the same lending. Can you nod if I'm saying this correctly? Okay, thank you. What I have found with different developments, let's say in Chicago, is if the investment is coming in, then it's through like a federal program, like through HUD, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or some sort of like low-income housing tax credits, or it's usually government. Like if there's a lack of private investment, whether it's through bank or venture capitalists, I am seeing that developments that are happening in Chicago are tied to government money. And that's how they are getting done. I think that's great. That should happen. I don't think that's the model that these communities should be relying on. It should not be the only game in town for development in Black communities. And that's what I feel like I'm starting to see more and more when I see announcement for development, who's the funding behind it. It's, tax credit programs that are issued through Treasury, like new market tax credits, low-income housing tax credits, we were talking about this earlier, which were kind of in limbo because of the Trump tax cuts. It's not as much of an incentive for people to get those tax breaks. I mean, they have a tax break. They don't need the tax credits as much anymore. Yeah, so we just had a primary election last week, and the voter turnout in the city was about 29%. And that is pretty standard across rate, like it's not Black people are voting any less or more. When Harold Washington ran for mayor both times, the voter turnout was like in the 80% citywide, and probably even higher for Black communities. Like our voting rates tend to be, and I hear these gasps, you should gasp, 30% is pretty standard. Now, some people say, oh, there are not enough good candidates. I'm at the point now where I don't believe in politics as the way for social change. I think it's activism, whether you're right or to the left, that moves the middle to either go a little bit more right or a little bit more left, or to put pressure on politicians to do certain policies or do the right thing. I don't find that it's politicians, and I know I'm generalizing, who just wake up and say, I'm going to do the best thing that I think should happen for my constituents. I think that they are moved and pressured to do those things. What Harold Washington did was open up, there's the Chicago machine, Patriot, all sorts. I mean, Chicago is a rough and tumble, dirty place to do politics. It is the best game in town after the Bulls and the and the Cubs and the White Sox. It's a blood sport in the city. And in Illinois, and governors go to jail, city council people go to jail. Going to prison is not something that's like, oh my gosh, can you believe that? It's part of the culture. Corruption is part of the culture. Corruption that's even small. There's a thin line between quid pro quo, scratching someone's back, and corruption. So there are a lot of elected officials who end up being self-serving, or they're trying to keep their job. And so Harold Washington broke through a lot of that by even giving people jobs in City Hall, by having truly a coalition. He couldn't have won just with white people. And what happened is that Mayor Richard M. Daley became mayor, and he decided to reward Hispanics by creating the Hispanic Democratic Organization. Because and you still had Daley winning every time that he won, but when I mentioned earlier about like the whites being the power structure and they decide who they're going to reward or who's going to be in second place, that's an example of that. I am really heartened to see young Black activist leadership in Chicago that's really been rooted around police brutality. And, I hate to, so did anyone is everyone familiar with Laquan McDonald, the teenage boy who was shot 16 times by a white Chicago police officer? And the trial for the police officer is coming up this spring. And the Laquan McDonald video came out after we heard about Freddie Gray in Baltimore, Michael Brown in Missouri, Eric Gardner in New York. And it was this idea like, what's going to happen in Chicago? What's going to happen in Chicago? Is Chicago going to riot? Is there going to be an uprising? And I did a story about why Chicago didn't, because there actually wasn't infrastructure. Now, it's not like those communities didn't know those things were happening. So when Laquan McDonald, I mean, the activists wanted it released, but a lot of them like, I don't even want to see the tape. I know what was on the tape. And there was an infrastructure of Black Lives Matter, Black Youth Project 100, which is a national-based organization, but headquartered in Chicago. Assata's Daughters, there's all, and right now they're fighting against a $95 million police academy being built on the west side that the city says will be economic development. Black people in Chicago are not asking for more policing. And now the city has said they're going to name that facility after a white police officer who was killed in the line of duty a few months ago. So that even makes it more politicized. It's like, oh, you're protesting the commander who was killed downtown. I mean, it was a really freak kind of thing that happened. The commander was at a training and there was a guy that was running downtown. This is like in the middle, like at the heart of the city by City Hall. I think there's more to the story because this guy had a bulletproof vest on, and yeah, he shot the police commander, and that paralyzed the city for about a week because people don't want police officers killed. And then he's this great guy, and I'm not saying that he wasn't a great guy, and I'm not trying to sound cynical about it at all, but when those things happen, it shifts the story about the police brutality, and it becomes centered on this great husband and father who was killed in the line of duty. And if you decide to name this facility after him, then it's going to look like you're protesting that man and not protesting why is $95 million being spent in an economically depressed neighborhood where people do not want more policing. When we talk about violence, you rarely hear anyone saying, I would really love more police in my neighborhood. They're asking for jobs. They're asking for economic development. They're not asking for more policing. Well, I think we're just about at the end of this time anyway, so I'm going to stick around. Hopefully, like what you heard, you might buy a book, and I'll stick around and sign it. But thank you so much for coming out. I really appreciate it.